We are excited to talk about parenting today. I'm Jenny Radesky. I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician and media researcher at University of Michigan. I also am chair of the AAP Council on Communications and Media and co-medical director of the AAP Center of Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health. And I'm here today with other members of our research consortium. We call ourselves the CAFE Consortium, which is comprehensive assessment of family exposures. So we'll be each talking. I'm going to start with an overview of the some general principles of our theoretical framework. And then we're going to have Rachel Barr, then Heather Kirkorian, then Sarah Coyne, talking about ways that we're applying this model through new data collection in different aspects of child development, so from infancy through adolescence. So we can move on over to the slide deck, and thank you for your help. While we're getting started, just wanted to acknowledge the fact that we all met at the Children and Screens conference in, I think, 2015, in a workshop on methods where we were all getting together frustrated about screen time methods and global measures of kids' media use, because we understood that parenting around media was a lot more complicated than that, and we wanted to find new measures and new frameworks to assess the way media was being integrated into family life on a daily basis. And we've been working together since, writing grants. We've received some seed funding from Children and Screens. We've now received 3 grants from NICHD to both pilot new methods and test out new hypotheses and conceptual frameworks. So I want to definitely thank our funders for supporting our work. I'm going to start just with a general overview of the rationale behind our theoretical framework. When we're talking about parenting, though, it's always important to recognize the social and cultural embeddedness of that concept, that term in itself, especially since parenting as an activity has really only been a verb since the late 20th century, other than just being a parent in relation to raising a child. In the US specifically, child rearing is much more conceptualized on an individual basis. It's your nuclear family, your parents helping raise a child, rather than the more collective or community-based experience. A lot of the assumptions we have around parenting and child rearing in the US stem from the fact that we don't have a robust social safety net here in the US, so there's a lot of competition for resources, there's a lot of intensive parenting to curate kids' experiences, optimize them for competition in the marketplace. That is a pretty unique US experience, and this can lead to a lot of middle-class parents, feeling this competitive energy around parenting, not feeling good at it, feeling like they're comparing themselves to expert advice. And screen time is so wound up in that whole conversation. So I just start with that background in order to surface these biases or assumptions about parenting that we always take to research. And it's even more important then to have very rigorous and reproducible and very conceptually driven research so that we can be as objective as possible when talking about how media fits into parenting young kids. So most of the scientific frameworks around parenting are really dyadic. We talk about the parents' experiences, the parents' characteristics and traits that they bring to child rearing. We think about the child's traits, their temperament, their self-regulation, and then we also measure the relationship between them. We can study things like attachment or sensitivity during a parent-child play routine. We may think of this in terms of how a parent is mentalizing about their child's development or how they're helping a child with emotion socialization. Now, when it comes to media and how that is integrated into the parenting experiences, there's been studies looking at how media relates to the parents' characteristics. I have a few sites in each of these slides. They're just like a select few of the first ones that came to my head. If any of you have done research on this topic, I'm sorry if I excluded you, but there's been research showing that families, parents with more mental health issues, more depressive symptoms, more postpartum depression, more parenting stress are more likely to use media or use media for longer or more through the day. There's also research that children with more self-regulation issues are more likely to use media for longer or more likely to use media to calm down. So the child's individual characteristics do a lot to shape how media is used and how that relates to child outcomes. And then media can also interfere or disrupt or displace the parent-child interactions that occur that might be through displacement of parent-child verbal interactions or play. It might be technoference in terms of, phones being picked up and just, subtly interrupting parent-child relational activities. But it can also be the child's media use. Some of our research, lab-based research, has looked at the way that digital affordances and interactive affordances make it harder for parents to interact with kids around media. Then you also can have the positive side of joint media engagement, where media can be this launching point for play ideas or self-regulation ideas, or when parents and kids are learning together around media or relating together around media. And then lots of research has looked at how parents mediate the child's relationship with media. Of course, all this exists within a sociocultural and family context. So this has been a very, very quick overview over dyadic models and how different parts of this model relate to media use. But we wanted to improve upon this type of conceptual model because this is very flat and static. All this is, if you were to run a study to test one of these conceptual models, you'd probably use some cross-sectional data or some data from a big cohort and say, yeah, this global measure of parent depression is associated with, more use of parent social media or something like that. The truth about parenting is that it is very dynamic. It's not static. It's dynamic along micro scales of second-to-second changes in the way that parents and kids have serve and return interactions. Parenting is also dynamic on longer time scales. This I just included as an example of that smaller time scale of the serve and return verbal interactions of joint attention. I love this picture. I took it from the Harvard Grad School of Education because when you look for stock images of serve and return interactions online, they're always like some mom gazing down at her baby, and they both look like heavenly, so happy, which is not what parenting feels like most of the time. And I loved this because it's like, you found a moth! And that's the sort of things we do with our kids on a day-to-day basis. They're totally, boring and humble, but they really do matter for kids' everyday experiences. So that's the micro time frame where we know that media can insert itself into some of those serve and return interactions. There's also the more macro time frame that you can have this cascade of a parent's characteristics and how that influences the infant's characteristics and how that feeds back into the way the parent responds to them and how that in turn might shape how the baby responds to them, right? So this is a great example from a textbook, just as the way a developmental transactional model would change the trajectory of a child's social or emotional development. In pediatrics or clinical psychology or any of our interventional fields, we're working really hard to change that trajectory to a more positive place where parents can understand their kids more or they can have more positive interactions. But it's really important that we interrogate the way media fits into these cascades because that's going to be easier for a point of intervention. This is an example from a nice article in Journal of Adolescence about how these developmental cascades and transactional models occur in adolescence too. That this study was looking at adolescent social withdrawal and the parenting response with psychological control or parent knowledge and the way that would shape the adolescent's mental health over time. So these are just a few examples of how do we study media within this more complex dynamic framework rather than kind of our static conceptual models. We were all, when trying to study this, were very influenced by Arnold Samaroff's newer unified theory of child development. This is a really complicated model, but what we loved about it was this idea of self and other being so relationally and transactionally connected over time, from infancy to adulthood, with lots of bidirectional effects, lots of nesting within the social ecology, as well as the child's biology and psychology. So that informed the framework that we're going to talk about in examples from research today. And the reason that we really wanted to introduce a more dynamic and relational and ecologically nested conceptual model is we hypothesize that is going to have more interventional relevance. Because if you just take your flat conceptual model and you say, yeah, depressed moms have more screen time. Depressed moms should reduce their screen time. You don't know how. You don't know what barriers are going to be to doing that. You don't even know if that's going to, make that mom feel more isolated or feel more empowered. So within a more dynamic and relational and ecologically nested model, we'll be able to examine some of the cascades of these interactions as they occur, starting with, at the center, is the individual characteristics of the child, the diet, and the parent. In our studies, like our current P01, we're really focusing on child temperament, parents' executive function. What are these things that shape your everyday choices, or not choices, reactions, when you're with your kids? And that really starts by influencing media reasons. What was the motivation, the uses and gratifications, or the habit-driven reason that media was used in a household? Is it to calm? Is it to escape from stress? Was it to try to seek social support or share positive content? That's going to determine how media are used and what media are used. So we're analyzing things like both the parent and the child, duration, content quality, interface design. Is it engagement prolonging? Is it a profiled feed to try to keep the parent on longer? And how much is it solo versus joint media engagement? And that's going to influence how the child responds to media. So this is very driven or derived from Valkenberg's differential susceptibility model, is that you want to know what that psychological or physiological response was to the media that they experienced. And many of us see this both as parents feeling overloaded or their stress reduced, children getting behaviorally dysregulated when they have to transition away from media, or being calmed in that moment. And it's these aspects of these kind of more proximal parent-child relational dynamics that will then shape the outcomes. We're looking at social competence, self-regulation, language skills, parent self-efficacy and burnout in our grants, but you can imagine the way that this might be applied to other outcomes that you're studying. And all of this is nested within structural factors. We're looking at things like access to childcare across different countries, psychosocial stressors that might be shaping differential impact of media, as well as COVID lockdowns. So I'm going to transition now first to Heather Kirkorian to talk about the way that we're trying to apply this model within early childhood. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for the setup. Thank you, everybody, for being here, sticking around from a long day, but hopefully an energizing day. I'm Heather Kirkorian from the University of Wisconsin. We've tried to organize these presentations to give you a big snapshot, like Jenny just gave, and then talk about the different developmental periods that we're working in. So my area is primarily infancy and early childhood, so I'm going to talk to you a bit about Project EMU. The ecology of media use, our cute little baby emu, was drawn by Jenica Lee, one of my graduate students, to represent this project. I'm not going to share a lot of data with you today, but I want to more introduce concepts to help illustrate what we're doing in this project. And then there's a poster later that I'll allude to that gives you some actual data, kind of the first off the press results from our pilot study. Just to focus our conversation, I'm going to talk about one particular parent characteristic. We're capturing a lot here, but parental burnout is one thing in particular we care a lot about as a group here, but in particular in my part of this P01 grant. If you're not aware, parental burnout is characterized by overwhelming exhaustion, emotional distancing from the child, and a loss of a sense of accomplishment in the parent's role as a parent to their child. It is a relatively common mental health problem, especially in the United States. It affects 8 to 9% of parents in the United States, so much more common than a lot of the other things we might have been doing research on previously. And the rates in the US are among the highest in the world among dozens of countries that have been studied. So this is something that, for all those reasons, we're focusing on it in this study. Folks who theorized about what produces parental burnout say that it's about an imbalance between risks and resources in that parent's life. And interesting to me, you can imagine why I jumped on this one sentence in their paper. They perceive restrictions on kids' media access as a risk to parent burnout development, a risk that might lead to parent burnout. So I thought that was really interesting. They don't study media use, but they actually saw it as fitting into this context as a potential risk to parents. And so here we're talking about parents' well-being as the outcome measure rather than kids' well-being. And we're finding in a couple of our preliminary studies that parental burnout is pretty strongly correlated, relatively speaking, with both parent and child media use. And the figure on the right, I know the font is tiny, I don't intend for you to read it, but I wanted to illustrate what we're seeing in our preliminary data. So the lighter gray dots are from a meta-analysis on correlates of parental burnout in many countries around the world. And then the blue and red dots, the darker ones on the screen, are ones from our preliminary data. In the red dots, it's parents' regulatory use of media or using media with their kids to calm their kids down, help their kids sit still, kind of control kids' emotions and behavior in the moment. And the blue dots are parents' use of kids' media so the parent can step away, take a break. It might be escaping from stress so the parent can calm down and not react to their kid in a way they'll regret later. Or it might be, I have to get dinner on the table, I have to do work right now, keep the kid occupied. So in both cases, we see relatively strong correlations with parental burnout and these two reasons for using media. And the two dots at the top, the strongest correlations here, are from daily measures of parental burnout and media use as opposed to a single global estimate. So I'll talk about that more later, but I wanted to draw attention to that point while it was on the slide. So through Project Media, we're interested in can media actually be a resource for parents in this situation? Even if there's a cost-benefit balancing walk, we have to play between the parent's outcome and the kid's outcome. So can it be a parent resource? Does it actually benefit parents in the moment? What are both the short-term and long-term impacts on not just the parent, but the child as well in this kind of dynamic relational process? So those are the main things we're focusing on here. Okay, great. So this is just a very brief, quick conceptual model for how this project was set up. So we're looking at parents' well-being, and I mentioned we're focusing on burnout in particular, but we have some other measures in there too. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's really meant to illustrate the model. That might lead to parent reasons for using media both themselves and with their children, with and around their children, and then child outcomes associated with that use. How those things have transactional effects. So for example, if a child is more or less regulated after media use, that might lead to parent stress and burnout and the likelihood they'll use media for the same reason in the future. So is that kind of a reward or a disincentive for using media at later time points? And then we're using an intensive longitudinal burst design. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. But essentially, we're looking at temporal effects across multiple time scales. So moment to moment within the same day, day to day within the same week. And then I put month to month, but really these are 6-month waves. So 6 month to 6 month, half year increments. So across those time scales, are these things related and in what direction? This is just a snapshot of this is our preliminary study. It was with parents of children 3 to 5 years old. So I'll just quickly describe what the design of this study looks like so you have a sense for the multiple data streams and multiple time scales we're trying to capture. What we call day 0 is the time of the onboarding call. We do consenting, answer parents' questions, install the passive sensing app on their phones and all of those kinds of things, thanks to Herculean efforts from some graduate students and undergraduate students, some of whom are in this room. So thank you guys for all of that work. That's day 0. They also get a big survey packet that has lots of measures you would all be familiar with, capturing demographic information, family screen time, both parent and child screen time, practices and attitudes, And then lots of parent, child, and dyadic assessment tools. So a big survey packet at the start of the week. And then every day for 7 days, parents got 5 EMA signals, so short little 1 to 2 minute surveys on their phones at random intervals throughout the day, every day for 7 days, so 35 signals total. Every day at the end of the day, at what we were hoping to be after child bedtime, parents got an end of day survey that was more like 4 or 5 minutes, reflecting on the entire day. Not just in that moment, and then a time use diary that kind of broke out every activity the child did, who was there. If it was media use, there were follow-up questions asking about the content and context of that media use. And then throughout this entire week, we have passive mobile sensing data on the parent's mobile device. So we have multiple data streams, multiple time scales, converging on similar, what we hope to be similar constructs. Here's an example of what those end-of-day surveys look like, which is what we're talking about in the poster later. So we have slider scales where we ask parents to reflect on the whole day, and on a scale from 0, not at all, to 10, very frequently, how often did you feel this way, or how much did you use media to achieve whatever goal? So we're asking about parental burnout and other emotional outcomes, parenting behaviors, child emotions and behavior, parents' reasons for using media themselves, and parents' reasons for their kids' media use. So we ask about all of these things every day for 7 days. And I wanted to take a minute to illustrate the richness and power of a data set like this. I've been delighted to hear words like person-centered approach or within versus between subject variability. I've been really excited to hear a lot of that already at this conference. Excuse me. But until a few years ago, I thought I understood what those things meant and have now learned there's much more to it than I thought. And some of you might not be familiar with that at all. So I want to illustrate what we're trying to do here. What you see here is one of our burnout questions, the parent stress question. In our EMAs, so up to 35 signals throughout that 1 week period, if you kind of blur your eyes, that dark line you see going from the top left to the bottom right, that's the parent's average stress across up to 35 signals throughout the week. But the lighter bars that go top to bottom is the range. Does that make sense? So within a person, hopefully it's clear there's tremendous variability from one moment to the next. And I'd like to sort of highlight a couple of people to unpack this a little bit more. These two parents that I'm highlighting for you have very different means. I think it was 2.7 for the person on the right and 5.4 on the left, something like that on this 0 to 10 scale. So very different means. But they both submitted 34 to 35 of those 35 surveys, so they gave us a lot of data. They both used the full range from 0 to 10 across that week. So if we were to just look at a single global estimate, these two people would look really different. But on some days, they're the same, and on some days, they're reversed. So over time, they're kind of fluctuating, and what we're most interested in is that kind of vertical variability. So when we say between person differences, it's comparing person A to person B. On average, this person was more stressed than that person. So that's the between person difference, and we have a lot of data on this already, some of which comes from people in this room. So kind of those global estimate surveys about parenting stress, for example, we might get that same kind of data. But then we also get this within person variability, and that's what we're most excited about seeing in this new data set. And because of sophisticated statistical modeling, we can look at both of these things simultaneously, which is really wonderful. And then I would just add, even with that between person effect that we've seen in prior studies, we get much more precise measures of stress in the life of a parent because we're not asking about, like in general, how stressed they are. We're asking about this exact moment, that exact moment. So it has higher precision. I'm not going to walk through the results here because you'll see these in Ava Foster's poster in a little bit. So I don't want to get into the details. That's not the goal of this panel. What I want to illustrate only, and if you can see numbers, ignore them for a minute because that's not what I'm going to talk about. Maybe this is a good moment to blur your eyes a little bit again. I talked about that between versus within person variability we can look at simultaneously. We did that here in this preliminary study. On your right, you see the between person findings from a complex model, multi-level structural equation model. And there's only one line on that graph, and what that means is only one of the many associations we looked at was significant when we just compare person A to person B on average. The one on the left is the within person model. So that's comparing parents to themselves across that week period. We see a lot of lines on that graph. What that means is it's those within-person processes, those dynamic processes that change over time that we're predicting here. And we're seeing much more coming through there. And that's associations between parental burnout, kid screen time, and parent-child interaction quality. I'll just allude to the current, that's our preliminary study. Our current PO1 grant is funding a much larger, more diverse sample of parents, starting with one-year-olds, parents of one-year-olds, and following them for a few years, and looking at a 21-day period. So this is just an abbreviated version of that, so that we get much longer trajectories. And the reason that's important is everything we look at so far is cross-sectional in a way. It's really looking at same-day behavior and burnout and that kind of thing, same-day media use. But with 21 days worth of data, we can actually use more advanced modeling. In this example, it's a temporal network model, where we can look at not just same-day associations, which is what's called the contemporaneous network on the left. This is hypothetical, by the way, the contemporaneous network on the left, but next day or multi-day lagged associations. So does media use today predict more or less burnout tomorrow, and vice versa? So we can look at those lagged effects with longer data terms. Lastly, why do we care about this? We've learned a lot from global estimates and between-person analyses. Don't get me wrong, we've learned a lot as a field from that kind of work, and that is valuable. But it seems like those global estimates or between-person analyses are masking a lot of the processes that Jenny was talking about earlier. So our field is riddled with null effects, tiny effect sizes, those kinds of things. And in some cases, they're just small effects. But in other cases, it's because of imprecise measurement that masks a lot of the variability, or looking for between-person differences when really these are day-to-day fluctuating associations. So that's one reason. The other reason is ultimately we want to look at child outcomes longer term and how that relates to these processes. I think there are two reasons. One is the research is very clear on this. Parents are people too. So I think their health and well-being should matter to us as well. But I think everyone in this room would agree kids' well-being and health is sort of partly driven by their caregivers' health and well-being. So this dynamic relational systems approach is really important to really understanding how best to intervene for kids and families, how best to benefit kids and families. And I'll stop there and turn things over to Rachel.
Get their slides ready, I'm just going to make a few kind of translational points in between. Is that what is so cool about Heather's findings is that if you are within your own person recognizing these day-to-day fluctuations in your mood, in your connection with your kid, or in the way content or amount of media or timing of media is affecting you as an individual, that is such a potential powerful interventional point that would be delivered more by a therapist, maybe someone using a DBT sort of approach where you're looking at like, what was that trigger and what came after it and how did my mood relate to that? But it just opens up new doorways for thinking of, rather than thinking, okay, this cluster of parents needs to reduce their media use, you could be more thinking on the individual level in terms of interventional, insight-based or reflection-based, or experimenting with your own media use and changing your feed and things like that. So, on to Rachel.
Thank you. So I'm going to shift a little bit to preschool and middle childhood, and I'm going to talk about a period in very recent times of COVID, and how is it that COVID may have been associated with all of these other outcomes. So during COVID, you may have had loss of childcare, you may have had shift to virtual schooling. There was a global increase in screen use. And so what I'm going to do is go through the Dreamer model using quite a lot of the data collected from the CAFE Consortium, both in the US and across the globe, to see how this model may help us understand some of those shifts in media use at this very stressful time for the whole planet. So we've just amped up and increased stress for everybody at the structural level. How does that influence overall media use? I'm going to start with individual child and parent factors. So I just mentioned screen time increased during COVID across the globe. And there's a couple of studies that really, I think, demonstrate this nicely from middle childhood. And both of these studies had measures both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And so in the first study on the left, parents of 4 to 12-year-olds, what they found is it wasn't just everybody who was affected, but minoritized Black and Latino children had much larger overall increases in media use from pre-pandemic to pandemic levels. So there are individual differences that are really important for us to consider. Second, the thing that, and we're going to come back to this again, that media use, including educational media use, remained elevated even after health restrictions were lifted. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in another study as well. And on the right, in a study of 5 to 12-year-olds, looking at problematic media use, which we've already heard about a lot in this conference, it was shown that in children who were 5 years and older, problematic media use increased pre to during COVID. But the other thing that was really important about this particular study that was showing the change in problematic media use was also getting the voice from the parents, who described the absolute challenge. If any of you have parented during COVID and had children in school during COVID, you'll recognise this, the absolute challenge of enforcing different media rules and having different media practices when your children were actually in virtual schooling as well. So that's a global shift. This was in the US, it was across multiple different countries, multiple different studies. But I want to dive into this idea of problematic media use. And so this is from a study actually conducted by Sarah Coyne, and it compares data from both New Zealand and the US. And it was conducted during the pandemic when children were 3.5 and 4.5. And I'll just define again, you've heard a lot about problematic media use, but it's defined as this excessive media use that interferes with normative functioning. So difficulty transitioning away, sneaking media, having meltdowns and tantrums, and also using media to cope with difficult emotions. So these may be children who are potentially more at risk of developing long-term negative outcomes. And during the pandemic, it was about 23 to 25% of children in these samples in the US and in New Zealand who had problematic media use. But I think the really important thing to note in this particular study was that the parenting was also related to this. So there was more conflict in the parenting relationship and less closeness was being associated with higher problematic media use. So in this case, really disrupting that parent-child relationship. And also there was a longitudinal risk here as well, where both the parent and the child at 3.5 years predicted more problematic media use at 4.5 years as well. So we, again, thinking about these individual characteristics, there may be some children who might be more at risk. And now I want to move on to thinking about, so we've thought about the individual child, now we want to think about a particular outcomes. And to talk about a study conducted in Canada by Caroline Fitzpatrick, who's also here, where they had a look, and you heard also Marie gave a beautiful presentation during the Flash Talks yesterday as well. But they collected data also during the pandemic of 3.5 and 4.5-year-olds, collected during 2020 and 2021. And I'm going to keep on highlighting when the data was collected because I think it's really going to be critical for our understanding of shifts in use and maybe shifts back. And what they found was that screen time at 3.5 predicted anger and frustration at 4.5, controlling for all of a many number of factors. And then on the right-hand side, what you can see is this cross-lagged model, which showed that more screen time at 3.5 was associated with higher levels of frustration and anger at 4.5, and that screen time was predicted at both ages as well. So both of these studies, some negative outcomes and associated parenting during the pandemic. But now I want to have a look at one other study that was conducted in Israel, and there was another finding that from Israel yesterday that had very similar findings. Now we're going to see, well, what happens if we actually look at the effect of the pandemic and outcome behaviours. So in this study, again, Noah Gurinsala, she's also part of the CAFE Consortium, and during the pandemic in Israel, there were very, very specific lockdowns. So the whole country went into a very clear lockdown, and she collected data at 3 of those lockdown periods, and then a final period where it wasn't lockdown. And no, that's not what I wanted to do. Here. Oh, sorry, I hope I didn't blind anybody. Here is the low level of screen time before the pandemic, going up during the 3 lockdown periods, and again staying higher once the health restrictions were removed. Here is background TV, which initially at the beginning stages of lockdown was much higher as parents were seeking information about this threatening virus, and went down over time. So they looked at the relationships between the types of screen media and then child outcomes, so externalizing and internalizing behavior. And during COVID, during those periods of extreme lockdown, when the families were under heightened stress, the screen time was related to higher levels of lockdown. However, once those lockdown restrictions were lifted, media patterns were not related to child behaviour problems. So I want to suggest that when we think about the reasons why parents are using, under what conditions, when they're under more stressful conditions, and how that's impacting the child, you need to think about the larger structural context that the families are operating under. And that it's not necessarily, even if you just see a relationship between screen time and negative outcomes, that there aren't other structural factors that we really need to consider, like a pandemic. And so I'm going to finish on one final thing to think about, and we've talked a lot about access to devices and having too much access to devices, and one of the things that I want to highlight that hasn't yet been mentioned is that there are associations between families and their access to digital devices. There's no longer a strict digital divide. 97% of US families of children under 8 have a cell phone device. However, there is absolutely under-connectivity, and this has been defined by Vicky Katz. And what that means is that people are sharing devices, that these devices are older. If you're living in rural communities, you may not have good bandwidth. And during the pandemic, what that resulted in this under-connectivity for children who are living in low-income families really significantly disrupted academic performance, particularly for low-income children. And so if there's a really nice summary of these findings, I put the website there, but I want to think about, well, what are those structural factors that may be changing the amount of media use? If it's taking you longer to get online because you've got a really old device and a really bad internet connection, you may actually just be spending more time in screen time, partly because you're underconnected. So we want to just think about all of these factors, and now I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk about adolescence.
And as Sarah's getting ready, I think the main point that we wanted to get across about this examination of the structural factors is that these are often adjusted for statistically, to say, how do we control for SES? How do we control for all of these background factors that might actually be really important moderators or really important constraints on intervention? And so I think that it would be awesome if there was not only the kind of naturalistic experiments of what happened pre and post COVID, but also what happens pre and post implementation of federal legislation around design or data collection or other sorts of things that will shape what shows up in children's laps and will shape the way that parents need to work to mediate or moderate those experiences. So unfortunately, we can't do the California to Michigan comparison that I was hoping we would, since the injunction passed at the California Age-Appropriate Design Code, but we really should be working more across countries to be examining what does it look like for kids in EU and UK right now, what compared to what kids in the US are experiencing in terms of content design and profiling. So, on to Sarah.
Thanks, Jenny. First, before I get started, I again wanted to thank Children and Screens. I literally had my foot in the door of a session on medium violence in 2015 on that first one, and then someone's like, now go to this one. So I did an about face and then met these wonderful human beings, and it's really shaped my career. So thank you so much. Most of my current research right now is with really young children, which is why I showed up in that session. But Jenny asked me to talk about adolescence and apply the Dreamer model to adolescence. So I'll be doing a little bit of that with some work we've been doing, and then also kind of pick apart it just a little bit, which I know is rare when you're presenting your own research, but I think hopefully it will make a good point here. Okay, so like Jenny said, parenting teenagers around media is similarly stressful around media, and many parents report, again, high levels of burnout, tremendous guilt, right, when you ask them about their own child's media use, high levels of stress. They know they're using their phones too much, and they still use their phones a lot, and they're worried about it and anxious, and right, it's this really complex experience being a parent right now of teenagers and media use, and it's really quite messy as well. So talk about some general trends, some wider things, right, around parental mediation or parental media monitoring, and then some recent studies looking at parenting, parent media use, and adolescent outcomes. Okay, so some of my earlier work kind of tracked these things over time. So if you're in the parental media monitoring world, you know you've got restrictive mediation, which tends to be limits and rules, right? Regulations, what we know is that's pretty high in early adolescence and then declines as children develop and gain more autonomy. Active mediation are the conversations that we have with our kids around media. That kind of remained high-ish, but also declined throughout adolescence. And then we have something called deference, which really we have not talked about as a field yet. I'm curious to why we haven't explored this in greater detail, but deference is a general parenting term where it's saying, I trust you to make good choices around substance use, peers, and media. And in the general parenting literature, deference is related to some really good outcomes for adolescents, especially older adolescents. And what we find is that deference specifically around media tends to be a little lower in early adolescence and then increases over time, as it naturally should. This is just another, it's kind of like a more of a person-centered approach type of thing, looking at the different types of co-viewing or co-use, and am I just doing it because I want to monitor my kids' use, or am I doing it to actually connect with them? And that's my purpose behind that, and these are differentially related to adolescent outcomes. Thank you for that. Okay, so I wanted to give you just a little example of a study we did. It was one of the more fun studies that I've done, and how it might apply to the Dreamer model. This is with my former grad student, Jane Shawcraft, who's here, and some others. So what we did is we went and we watched families eat dinner. The title is called McDonald's Mom, Media, and Me, which is a great source of alliteration. I'm really proud of that title. So we watched families with teenagers eat. And we were specifically looking around their digital use during these interactions, and maybe what were triggers, and when did they stop, and how did it impact the relationship and the experience, right? Because we're always telling families, family dinner is a good thing. Have family dinner. It's associated with all these great outcomes. Okay, we found that 88% of families, somebody in that interaction used some sort of a media device. Okay, so it's very common, very normal. It's split pretty evenly between the parents and the teenagers themselves. So both parties are doing this. Notable triggers for media use included somebody else pulling out their phone. So, for example, it was really common for dad to get on their phone, for example, and then the teen would get on their phone, or vice versa. So there's kind of like a triggering effect that happens around media use in a family context here. Ending media use included accepting another family member's bid for attention, which is like, mom's on her phone and the kid's like, hey, Mom, and oh yeah, I'll put it down and then I'll engage. And so it's a direct bid for attention. And most of this observational research has been done with really young kids. So it's interesting to look at this in a population that also have their cell phones here. When we think about the model, okay, so right, we've got 3 people here, just random stock photo. Every single person is bringing to the table, literal table, right, their temperaments and the day that they just had, whether it was a really rough day at school or work was amazing or we just had a fight before we got out here. Right? So they're bringing that to that situation. That's that kind of individual person-centered. Media use, right, is what they're actually doing, whether that's the time that they're spending, the content, what are they looking at, or so on. Media reasons. Okay, so why did I pull out my phone? Is it because I'm feeling ignored by my parent? Is it because the food hasn't come and I'm really bored and, all right, I'm just going to check Instagram? Is it because I'm stressed out about something and so I'm just going to disconnect? There's all sorts of reasons there. And then these responses to media are, what is my response to my own media use and then to somebody else's? So whether that's saying, hey, put down your cell phone, Mom, pay attention, or whether it's, oh my gosh, that looks so fun, let me see what you're looking at, and then we'll have this nice interaction, right? So we have to look at this again, wider family media context to understand what the impact is. And what we found is that in general, families use media in this really positive, engaging way that was good. Sometimes when it has technoference, it was related to worse kind of conversations or so on, but it was really mixed. So there was that little study. Okay, I'm going to just do, this is a national cross-sectional study that we did last year with Emily Weinstein and some colleagues here at BYU. And I want to say this is a cross-sectional study. This doesn't speak to causality in any way, shape, or form. But these are some things that tend to co-occur together that I think is interesting. And we're focusing on parenting. Okay, so this was a really interesting finding. So we did not find that the time that adolescents themselves spent on social media predicted mental health. That finding was not there. We did find that the time the parents were on social media predicted adolescent depression and anxiety. It also tended to predict adolescent social media use. There's a moderate correlation there, but parents' own media use seemed to be a better predictor of teen outcomes, at least in time, than the child's. So that kind of gets at that media use, right? Part of the Dreamer model. We also look at something called technoference. Most of the technoference literature has been done with young children, but certainly it can exist in an adolescent environment as well. So here's some just general statistics. Some of these were nice, right? So 50% of them were saying, my parents don't really ever ignore me when on their cell phone or tablet. That's good. I think that's great. Okay, but then we're finding that technoference, parental technoference, was highly related to adolescent negative outcomes in terms of mental health. So the kids that are saying, my parents are always on the phone, I'm trying to get their attention, tend to report higher levels of depression and anxiety. All right, let's talk about parent responses to child media. So how then do I respond to my child's media use? How do I try to monitor it, to talk to them, or so on? So again, here's some statistics in general. And this is a child report of parent media use, mediation. Children are saying, my parents, on the whole, are regularly talking to me about my media use. We've got some restrictions here on content and time and so on. But I love these findings. Like the highest ones are talk about the content, right? That's good. Okay, what we found here is that our teens who had the highest rates of depression in our sample tended to have parents who had the most rules around media. So this idea of, okay, we just got to limit, we got to crack down, we got to, stop using the phone, this very restrictive view actually is not related to positive outcomes. And again, it might be the kids that are all over the show, right, whose media use is out of control and who are depressed and anxious. Their parents are in response to that. But it doesn't seem that really high levels of restriction tend to be great, and that's across the board for adolescents in general. Child responses to parent responses. This is getting at the responses part of the model here. We looked at something called adolescent media concealment, which is how often do you do something online you don't want your parents knowing about, or how often are you sneaking this? Yeah. And again, most adolescents are saying not so much, but we certainly have some that do. The ones that are sneaking things, that are lying, that are concealing, tend to report by far the worst outcomes. And again, whether it's the sneaking and concealing that's related to worse outcomes, or whether it's we already have pretty bad outcomes, so I'm going to hide all my media use from you, that's unknown. It's also really, really messy. We asked them, how often do you argue with your kid over their cell phone? And has your child's cell phone helped or hurt their relationship? Interestingly, that lower one, it's the lowest on hurt, which is great. It wasn't really related to adolescent mental health, and it's messy. So 67% of those who argue regularly about their child's phone use also say that technology has helped the relationship. It's really, really complex here. Okay, and then the very best predictor of adolescent mental health by far was simply warm and supportive parenting. I mean, by far. So adolescents are saying, my parents are warm and supportive, connected to them, mental health tended to be better. Okay, so this is a really nice, sweet study, right? It's great. I'm very proud of it. And also, thank you, it's easy to then tell parents, all right, get off your phones, especially when you're out with your kids, and just be a freaking better parent. And then we'll solve this mental health crisis, okay? Which I think is often, it doesn't contribute to assuage our guilt over our own phone use as parents. And in fact, so my governor, Spencer, I'm from Utah, right? We talked about some of the Utah social media bills earlier today, and it's a very mixed bag, but my governor used this study when he was, introducing the bill to say that very message to parents. And I was like, Spencer Cox, there's bigger than this. It's so much bigger, right? And so when we think about, and again, the Dreamer model gets at this, all of these interplays between different things and the wider structural context that we're missing in this whole equation, right? So when we think about, okay, why are parents on their phones when they're with their kids, and why are they not always a warm and supportive, great parent, right? It's because they have high levels of burnout. It's because we can't have access to affordable childcare. It's because when I go to the grocery store, my bill has doubled, and I'm stressed out, and now I gotta go get another job to feed my kiddos. It's because, I wanna send my kids out to play so they're not on their screens all day, but it is not a safe environment for me to do that. It's because we're experiencing high levels of sexism, racism, homophobia, and nationalism, both off and online, that I, as a parent, am really stressed about. I experience that, every single day, and my kid experiences that every single day. So there's all of these wider structural contexts when we think about how media impacts a family that we cannot ignore. Of course, media is part of the equation. Of course, it's something that we want to talk about. We're all here to talk about children and screens. But I love the Dreamer model because it asks those bigger and grander questions to really help solve the issue of child mental health. Thank you. Woo.
Love that. So we're going to wrap up. I think that Sarah translated everything for me, so I don't need to say anything. But I'm happy to stay around and answer questions, because I know we are at 5. Sorry we started late. But feel free to come up and ask questions and talk with us and think about study designs and whatever. Thanks all for coming.